Hi everyone, this is lecture 8 in Landscape Analysis and Green Infrastructure, and this week I will talk to you about aesthetical and emotional perceptions of landscapes. Based on the readings and also our own experiments in Lab 5, we are going to familiarize with this week with concepts of empirical and experimental aesthetics rooted in environmental psychology, and we would particularly focus on attention restoration theory related to environmental psychology. We will talk about the landscapes and explore them as our restorative environments and try to understand how being in various landscapes actually influences our emotions and our mental health. And we will talk about objective and subjective factors of landscape preferences and identify some predictive variables, both objective and subjectives, helping us to understand how we perceive the landscapes. In other way, how landscape aesthetics is determined by who we are as observers, but especially by the characteristics, by objective characteristics of landscapes themselves. Our readings this week are rooted in attention restoration theory, which is a theory developed in environmental psychology. And we will be using an article by Professor Herzig, who used to be professor of psychology here at GVSU, Restorative Environments. And I'm also asking you to choose at least one of these three papers, also by Professor Herzig and his students, Typicality and Preference for Positively and Negatively Value Environmental Settings, Tranquility and Danger in Urban and Natural Settings, or Mystery and Preference in Within Forest Settings. You can use one of these three papers, and this is required, even though they're based in the optional readings folder, because you need to choose one. If you do have time, I strongly recommend to read all these three papers. They are written in collaboration with GVSU students, and they're also using Grand Valley students as subjects in Herzig research. So this is very relatable, and it's especially relatable this week, which is extremely stressful. It is also relatable for all of us in this year when being exposed to the healing of nature and understanding how restorative environments actually help our physical and mental health is extremely important. Next week, we will continue with the same topic, reading health effects of viewing landscapes, landscape types in environmental psychology by Dr. Verlado. So you can go ahead whenever you are ready and continue with those readings for the next week as well. And our Lab 5 integrates actually both Lab 5 and Lab 6. There will be no separate Lab 6. And it will be based directly on those readings. And I would explain this lab today after the lecture. When I teach this class on campus, when I teach this class in the traditional classroom, I usually start this lecture with a brief meditation when I ask students to close their eyes and just mentally transport themselves to the ideal place, which is extremely pleasant and extremely relaxing, and just a place where you would like to be here and now. Well, that might be even easier when we're meeting on Zoom. So whenever you are right now, imagine that you are in your ideal, perfect, pleasant place. So close your eyes and just pause for a few minutes. You don't need to go to the next slide until you are ready. And just imagine that absolutely perfect place. You are feeling great. You are feeling super relaxed. And try to take notice of what are characteristics of this perfect, wonderful place that you would rather be today rather than in front of this computer. Now I'm going to show you a few random landscapes. All you need to do is just to record your immediate response. Don't even try, first exploring why. Simply respond. So look at this picture and take a notice. Do you like it? Are you feeling neutral or you dislike it? Let's take a look at this picture with very similar colors and some same elements and maybe same season. Do you like it? Are you feeling neutral or you dislike it? We can come back to any of those pictures later and try to make sense why we are responding in certain ways. Let's take a look at this cityscape. Are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling neutral? Or you're feeling stressed here? There is no obviously correct answer. It might be all of the above. Again, just take your notice. Let's take a look at this picture. It's very familiar, right? If you are here in West Michigan, are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling neutral? Or you are feeling stressed? Again, all we need to do is just to take a notice right now of your immediate response to the landscape. So if you have just recorded your responses to these 4 pictures that I have shown you, let's explore how these responses can be influenced by some objective factors related to the landscapes themselves and subjective factors that are related to you as an observer. So here are some definitions that will be important for the remaining activity in this lecture and especially for the Lab 5 that we are going to start this week. We will talk in the lab about the target variables and predictive variables. In other words, dependent variables and independent variables. The target variable is the variable whose value we want to model or predict by other variables. This is a dependent variable. For example, if I ask you, do you like this landscape? Or do you feel relaxed by looking at this landscape? Or do you feel stressed or depressed by looking at this landscape? This is our target variable. This is what we are trying to measure. It also dependent variable because its value depends on various factors associated either with you as an observer or with the landscape itself. And so the way how we feel about the landscape really depends on both who you are and what is your personal experience, but also it depends on many objective characteristics of the landscape, and this is what we are going to try to explore. So a predictor variable is a variable used to predict a target variable. It's an independent variable, and it can be objective or subjective. An objective independent variable is related to the landscape itself, right? It has nothing to do with you. For example, does the landscape has water in it, or does the landscape have vegetation, or does it have buildings? Does it have lots of linear features? Is it heterogeneous? All this is objective, is associated with the landscape itself. Subjective characteristics, subjective variables are related to an observer. They're related to your personal experience and your own preferences. So there might be a multitude of different characteristics related to yourself that shape your immediate response, your subconscious response to the places that you are visiting. And so simple examples would be how familiar is this area to you based on your experience, where you grew up or who you are as a person or where you have traveled. So those are examples of subjective predictors. So here are some examples of objective and subjective factors affecting landscape perception. Examples of landscape or objective factors that influence the way how we respond to our experience in the landscape can include heterogeneity, fragmentation, presence of linear features, edges, connectivity. It can be climate, topography, vegetation. It can be natural setting. It can be grainness. It can be the way how the landscape is managed, the kind of neatness and cleanness. So it can be abiotic, biotic, and cultural, but it's all about the landscape itself. Subjective variables or subjective factors are related to the subject, to you in case of our Lab 5, the way who you are as a person and how your background influences the way how you feel about the landscape. So it can be your cultural background, your childhood experience, your travel experience, just your personal preferences. It can be related to your age, it can be related to your gender, it can be related to your perception of what is really familiar, because familiar means different things for different people. Your perception of what is exotic, because again, it's very much related to your experience as a person. So those characteristics are very subtle and they're extremely subjective. In the way how we are managing and planning and influencing our landscapes, we can not really, we can to some degree predict who are the users, who are the people who are living in the landscape, but it's a very, very limited area where we can influence the landscape to improve it, but we can certainly focus on their landscape characteristics themselves. Also for urban planners, this interrelationship between the objective characteristics of the landscape that can actually be improved and subjective characteristics of the population who lives in this landscape can be extremely important. So target variable is something that we are trying to understand or measure in the way how we are responding, how we are feeling in the landscape. Examples of target variables could be feeling of relaxation, or feeling uplifted, or feeling anxious, or feeling depressed. And predictive variables are the variables that are associated with subject and object. So predictive variables that are associated with the place itself, with the landscape, could be presence of nature, presence of water, presence of green spaces. It can be topography, it can be anything associated with the landscape itself. And examples of predictive variables associated with the subject are various characteristics of observers, such as your age, your gender, your childhood experience, your cultural background, and so on. So we're going to conduct a little experiment on ourselves together. During the next 10-15 minutes, I'm going to show you a number of slides, and I would ask you to record your response. Make yourself as comfortable as possible. Please do not start this exercise if you don't have enough of time. Don't think about anything else right now, because what will be important for us is really just to capture your first reaction. And our first two questions to rank and to measure would be your sense of pleasure and your sense of stress. So don't overthink why you're feeling in certain ways. Just you need to take a piece of paper and you need to take a pen or pencil, and as you are looking at the pictures that I'm going to flash very quickly in front of you, just record on the scale from 1 to 5 your response to each of this landscape. Are you feeling good about this landscape? So if you feel the highest level of pleasure, it's 5. It's the lowest level, it's 1. And then immediately after that, you are going to record your sense of stress. So again, the lowest stress would be 1, the highest stress will be 5. Then you are going to look at this picture again and try to identify very quickly if it looks familiar to you. So familiarity is, of course, a subjective predictive variable. And then on the flip side, is this place looks exotic to you? So again, this is a subjective predictive variable, and it's likely to be inverse to familiarity. And then you are going to capture your immediate response to this picture regarding the presence of open space. So open space is an objective or predictive variable. Capture your response. Again, don't think about it too much. 5 is the highest, 1 is the lowest. The next question is the presence of nature. Again, 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest, and this is, of course, another objective predictive variable associated with the landscape itself. And finally, setting care, your impression about how well this landscape is maintained, and it's another objective predictive variable. Before you start this exercise, make sure that you also have a copy of these 7 questions. So you can print them. My lecture notes are also available in PDF on the Blackboard. You can pause right now and get yourself ready. You can also write them down very quickly and just create some space for you where you can record these 7 responses as quickly as possible as you are looking at those pictures. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and you can just stop this video or rewind it, and when you are ready, we are going to look at the pictures. Okay, so let's go. On a scale from 1 to 5, please rate your sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space in this landscape, presence of nature, and setting care. I'm going to the next slide. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, nature, setting care. Next slide. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Next slide. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, setting care. Sense of pleasure, sense of stress, familiarity, exotism, open space, presence of nature, and setting care. So once you have gathered all your responses for these dependent and predictive variables, target variables and predictive variables, dependent and independent variables. And once you kind of make sense of which of those predictive variables are subjective and which of these variables are objective, go back to your responses and see if you see any correlations, if you see any pattern in what landscapes make you feel happy, relaxed, what landscapes make you feel stressed, and try to explain why, and try to see if you find any patterns between the characteristics of the landscape itself and also how this landscape looks to you. Is it familiar? Is it exotic? But also, are you influenced by the presence of green spaces, the nature, right? Are you influenced by the presence of open spaces? We had quite a few urban landscapes. We had some more natural looking landscapes. Again, try to explore how this is related to your perception of those landscapes. Again, there is no right and wrong answers. We are just learning the methodology that we are going to use also in the Lab 5, and we are exploring the role of subjective and objective predictive factors of landscapes, helping us to understand how they actually make us feel relaxed or stressed, how they make us feel happy or unhappy. So this is really the goal of our next exercise. The Lab 5 is essentially combining what I was planning for the Lab 5 and Lab 6. There will be no Lab 6 this semester. All this is going to be integrated in one lab, and I would be looking forward to reading your responses. If you do have any questions about the lab, please contact me. It's a little bit longer than all our previous exercises. It's also based on the pictures that I posted on the Blackboard. There is a tutorial that I posted for you as well, where you can actually see how you would do this lab if you were doing it with me. And again, if you have any questions about this empirical research on landscape aesthetics, please email me or come to see me on Zoom. And I will see you next week. Bye.